A deadline is approaching, carriers are moving, and missiles are being counted on both sides. Diplomacy is still on the table, but so is a regional escalation that could unfold in days, not months. The question many in Israel are asking isn't whether Iran will respond to pressure, it's how far Iran might go if it believes its regime is cornered, and what Israel's true nightmare scenario looks like if negotiations collapse. The next round of negotiations is approaching, and the rhetoric from Tehran is already boiling over. Iranian officials are warning that Europe is surrendering to Israeli demands, while Western leaders insist the talks are meant to prevent a wider conflict. But behind the speeches is a more urgent reality. Military posture is increasing, while diplomacy runs on a shrinking clock. A deadline of roughly a month has been discussed in political messaging, and at the same time, major U.S. naval and air assets are shifting closer to the region. Another U.S. aircraft carrier strike group is expected to arrive within weeks, reinforcing both strike capacity and missile defense coverage. Alongside the carriers, additional air defense systems such as THAAD and Patriot have been positioned to protect U.S. forces, bases, and regional partners from retaliatory missile or drone attacks. The menu of options being discussed in strategic circles typically centers on two categories: pressure designed to force concessions at the table, and the ability to execute strikes if talks fail. Among the targets that are often raised are Iran's nuclear infrastructure, elements of its ballistic missile production chain, and launch capabilities that could be used in a first wave of retaliation. There is also continuous discussion of operations aimed at command and control nodes and the internal security apparatus factions meant to disrupt regime coordination without committing to a ground invasion or occupation. That distinction matters. Even where military action is contemplated, the dominant assumption remains that a full invasion of Iran would be long, costly, and destabilizing. The more likely model, if escalation occurs, is limited, high-intensity action that seeks to compel a political decision rather than occupy territory. The idea is not total war, but coercion, a blend of credible threat, targeted action, and diplomatic off-ramps. Inside Iran, another pressure point is growing: domestic unrest and the regime's fear of losing control at home. The mourning cycle following deadly crackdowns on protesters can become a flashpoint in itself, and reports frequently describe intensified surveillance, arrests, and efforts to identify and detain activists. Human rights organizations have repeatedly raised concern about coerced confessions broadcast on state media, often involving minorities or vulnerable groups, messaging that can serve both to intimidate the public and to justify harsher sentences in advance. All of this is unfolding while a diplomatic track continues in Europe. Switzerland has a long history of providing neutral ground for sensitive talks, and Geneva is again being used as a venue where direct and indirect messages can move without every sentence becoming a public humiliation contest. Oman has also played a mediator role in past back-channel arrangements in the region, offering a channel that is quiet enough for pragmatic bargaining, but structured enough to keep talks from collapsing over optics. Still, the gap between positions remains large. Washington's core demand is that Iran's nuclear program be constrained in a way that prevents a rapid dash to a weapon, especially by limiting enrichment levels, stockpiles, and access to sensitive technologies. Israel's consistent position is that the nuclear file cannot be treated in isolation. From Jerusalem's perspective, the ballistic missile threat and Iran's proxy network are not side issues. They are central to the threat picture. Iran, meanwhile, often signals willingness to discuss limits and monitoring, sometimes including expanded cooperation with international inspectors, while drawing hard lines around what it calls its defensive deterrent, including missile capacity and regional partners. This is where the bargaining under fire model emerges, negotiations conducted under a visible buildup of force. The logic is straightforward. The military posture isn't separate from the talks, it becomes part of the negotiation, an implied warning that time is not unlimited and delay has consequences. At the same time, the diplomatic process offers an exit ramp that could prevent a regional spiral. But what does Israel fear most? The nightmare scenario is not just a strike-and-response cycle. It is a prolonged campaign of missile and drone barrages that stress Israel's layered defenses and exhaust interceptor stocks over time, particularly if attacks expand beyond purely military targets to symbolic or civilian infrastructure. Israel's defenses are among the most advanced in the world, with multiple layers designed to intercept different threats at different altitudes and ranges, and with U.S. systems integrated into the broader defensive picture. Yet even the best defense faces hard arithmetic. Prolonged barrages can erode inventories, increase the pressure on the home front, and force difficult prioritization decisions. There is also concern about escalation across multiple fronts. If Iran calculates that direct fire alone is insufficient, or if it tries to preserve plausible deniability, it may rely more heavily on allied armed groups across the region. The risk is a coordinated stress test: pressure from Gaza, pressure from Lebanon, harassment from Iraq or Syria, and longer-range threats from elsewhere, all timed to stretch response capacity and decision-making. In Gaza, the ceasefire environment remains fragile. Even under arrangements meant to reduce violence, repeated violations can occur. Armed squads emerging from tunnels, movement of weapons, intimidation inside civilian areas, and attempts to reassert control in places that should be neutral. The immediate pattern is familiar. When armed activity is detected near forces or civilian corridors, responses follow quickly to prevent ambushes or kidnappings. At the political level, one proposed day-after framework centers on a technocratic governing structure meant to take over civil administration and support stabilization and reconstruction. In theory, such a body would need real authority over civil systems and policing to function. In practice, the core problem is whether armed factions will genuinely relinquish power or merely rebrand it. Reports and claims frequently surface that militant elements seek integration into security structures, especially police mechanisms, as a way to preserve salaries, influence, and control over daily life. Those demands tend to be rejected by Israel, and often by international stakeholders, precisely because they keep the old coercive architecture alive under a new label. Complicating the picture are persistent allegations of militants operating in or around sensitive civilian sites. When armed men move through hospitals or use humanitarian environments to shield activity, it creates immediate danger for staff and patients and triggers international alarm. Neutrality of medical facilities is a core principle under humanitarian norms, and violations, whether alleged or documented, can collapse local trust and drive NGOs to pull teams out, worsening the humanitarian crisis and destabilizing governance efforts. To Israel, the military objective in Gaza has repeatedly been framed as dismantling organized armed capacity and preventing reconstruction of a war-fighting apparatus. Even after heavy degradation of forces, the tactical reality remains that remnants can survive underground, reappear in pockets, and exploit gaps in governance. That is why timelines for disarmament, no matter how ambitious, collide with operational and political constraints on the ground. In the north, the situation remains tense as well. In southern Lebanon, enforcement strikes continue against weapons depots, launch sites, and attempts to rebuild infrastructure near the border. These actions are often justified as responses to violations and as efforts to prevent a slow reconstitution of capabilities that could threaten northern communities. Discoveries of large rocket stockpiles in the past have reinforced Israeli insistence that even quiet rehabilitation can quickly become a major threat. Hezbollah's posture has also been described by various analysts as shifting under pressure: less visible movement near the border, greater dispersal, and an attempt to preserve core assets while reducing exposure. But the strategic problem remains unsolved. Weapons caches, underground sites, and smuggling routes can survive even after repeated strikes. The Lebanese state and army face international expectations to enforce sovereignty and address illicit weaponry, yet their capacity and political freedom to act decisively are widely viewed as limited. That mismatch between expectations and capability creates the conditions for continued Israeli action when threats are identified. In southern Syria, the situation intersects with the Lebanese front. Smuggling corridors and storage sites can be used to move equipment and transfer knowledge, and weapons discovered near border zones reinforce the fear that the region remains a staging ground for future attacks. Efforts to disrupt these pipelines aim to reduce the flow of missiles, drones, and communications gear that can enable coordinated action. Meanwhile, a separate but critical pressure campaign is economic. Iran's ability to fund its internal security apparatus and its regional network depends heavily on energy revenue. Any intensified focus on restricting oil exports, especially to major buyers, would strike at the regime's financial resilience. The logic is that economic constraints reduce room to maneuver, and in a system that relies on patronage and security spending, money pressure becomes political pressure. So where does this leave the region in the coming weeks? It leaves it in a narrow corridor between deal-making and escalation. Diplomacy continues in Europe, with mediators trying to keep both sides in the room. Military forces are positioning so that threats are credible, not symbolic. Iran is projecting defiance outward while trying to contain volatility at home. Israel is preparing for the possibility that deterrence fails and a multi-front campaign begins. And hovering above it all is the nightmare question: if leadership in Tehran concludes that the regime's survival is on the line, does it choose restraint to preserve what remains, or does it gamble on a final massive barrage meant to redefine the conflict and impose unbearable costs? This is the crossroads moment, a high-stakes negotiation under the shadow of armed readiness. The coming month is not simply another round of talks. It is a countdown either toward a constrained agreement that reduces immediate danger or toward a regional confrontation where decisions made in a few hours could reshape the Middle East for years.